Sporeth had been watching him for 11 minutes before she admitted, privately and without pleasure, that she had never once seen him sit still. The crystal cavern of Veloshun hummed at a frequency that older Myslith navigators called the voice beneath mapping. Every surface fractured the light differently depending on the hour, and at this hour the ceiling was throwing great broken sheets of amber and violet across the chamber floor like a cartographer's discarded drafts. Sporeth stood at the western survey pillar, her spore breath slow, her cap ridge perfectly level, reading the resonance charts for the third transit corridor. The charts were accurate. The corridor was navigable. She had already calculated 3 extraction routes in the event of instability, logged 2 contingency manifests, and updated the crew ledger with the morning's adjustments. She was, by every standard her guild recognized, managing this operation correctly. She had traded in 37 star systems and never been surprised. And yet, the human moved again. He was circling the largest of the crystal formations, a pillar twice his height, its base threaded with deep fracture lines from the last seismic event, and he was doing so with the particular attention of someone who was looking for something specific rather than simply looking. His hand stayed at his sides. He did not touch. He tilted his head at an angle that Sporeth's anatomical briefings had never explained and pressed his ear briefly against the crystal's outer face without making a sound. She noted this. She filed it under behavioral anomaly, non-threatening, low priority. Then she returned to her charts. He had been brought as a courtesy. That was the polite language her guild used when a client species insisted on sending a liaison to observe transit negotiations. The human administrative body had submitted one name, Arthur Lennox. The briefing described him as a cultural attaché with partial geological training. Sporeth had read this and understood it to mean someone they could afford to lose from a meeting, useful enough to seem like an offering, unimportant enough that his loss would not alter anything structural. She had noted, with the mild detachment she brought to all cargo assessments, that he wore a shell necklace. Unpolished, pre-industrial work, by the look of it. The shells were the pale, articulated kind that came from tidal flats, and they had been strung simply, without ornamentation, on a cord that had been repaired at least twice. She had catalogued it as a sentimental object of no material value and returned her attention to the charts. He patched a crack in the nursery wall himself. Her junior navigator, Peth, had mentioned that morning, with the soft tone Myslith used when they were feeling something they could not immediately categorize. When the maintenance crew was delayed, he found the compound in the supply closet and just did it. Sporeth had processed this. He folds his clothes, she said, and Peth had looked up. When he leaves his quarters each morning, everything folded, corners aligned. He finds comfort in small orderings. She paused. It is the behavior of a species that cannot tolerate large disorders, so it subdues the small ones instead. A coping mechanism. Mildly interesting. Nothing more. She did not watch him. There was nothing worth watching. Peth did not argue. Peth had learned not to. What Sporeth did not say, because it was not relevant to the manifests or the corridor projections or any of the 17 operational categories she was actively managing, was that she had memoized the names of every member of her court within the first transit cycle of meeting them. Every assistant, every junior navigator, every supply clerk. She had always done this. It cost her nothing to hold names, and she found that people, all species, across all 37 systems, moved differently when they understood themselves to be known. Better, steadier. It was a tool, nothing more. The human had asked her, on the second day, what all of their names meant. Not just what they were, what they meant. Species designation, naming etymology, any traditional weight the sound carried. He had listened to each answer without rushing her, and he had repeated each name once, carefully, in the correct tonal register. She had not expected that. The shell necklace caught the amber light as he turned from the crystal pillar. He looked toward the eastern passage, and something in his posture changed. Not dramatically, a settling, the way a structure shifts its load-bearing distribution before a test. Sporeth marked it in her peripheral awareness and did not look up from her charts. If you're already running the numbers on what a human could possibly do in a cavern full of something that rewrites neural tissue, stay with this story, because the answer is going to cost you some assumptions. The neural worm cluster entered through the eastern passage at the 14th minute. Sporeth heard it before she saw it, which was a standard order of events with a cluster and also, according to every survival briefing she had ever read, the worst possible sequence. Hearing first meant the vibration was already inside the crystal lattice, already threading through the resonant hum the cave used as its natural communication channel. By the time the sound reached her cap ridges, the worms had already distributed their frequency through every surface in the chamber. She felt her spores shift. Her cap ridge dropped 2 degrees involuntarily. The cluster was not one organism. That was the error most species made. It presented as a mass, a rolling, pale, semi-translucent knot of interlocking bodies, each segment capable of independent navigation once the central coordination signal broke down. The fashion network binding them together transferred force through the entire structure like a single continuous system, so that a blow landing on one point distributed its shock across every connected segment simultaneously, making localized damage almost irrelevant. You did not fight a neural worm cluster by targeting one part of it. You could not. The whole body received and redistributed everything. This was why the evacuation protocol for a cluster event called for immediate withdrawal. Not engagement. Withdrawal. Peth was already moving toward the secondary exit. The survey crew behind Sporeth was moving. Even the 2 Mycelith guards, whose professional function was specifically the management of physical threats, were moving. Sporeth's feet did not move, because her cap ridge had locked in threat assessment paralysis and her spores were emitting the involuntary sweet sharp distress signal that translated across most of the 37 systems she knew, as I am currently deciding whether I am going to survive this. And the human walked forward. His hand touched the wall, palm flat, feeling vibration. Sporeth watched him stand there with his palm pressed to the crystal face, his eyes closed and his head tilted at that same inexplicable angle. And she understood, in a way that had nothing to do with her briefing documents, that he was not afraid. He was not performing calm. He was not suppressing panic. He was simply somewhere she was not, doing something she had no category for. He took his hand off the wall. He exhaled once, the way a person exhales before a task they have done many times before. Then he walked into the cluster, not at it, into it. His body phased at the threshold, the edges of him blurring at some molecular frequency Sporeth's eyes could not track, and he passed through the outer membrane of the mass the way sound passes through crystal. Inside, and then, in the same moment that Sporeth's cap ridge completed its full involuntary wilt, he solidified. Hammered skull with fist. The sound was structural. It was not the sound of impact against organic tissue. It was the sound a load-bearing wall makes when something hits the precise point where its internal geometry has been compromised. The cluster's central coordination node collapsed inward, and the distributed force transfer that made it nearly invulnerable became, in that moment, the mechanism of its destruction. The shock moved outward through every connected segment at once. The whole mass convulsed, then stilled, then began the disarticulation pattern that meant coordination signal loss. He folds his enemies. Sporeth's spores had gone completely still. Her cap ridge was flat. She was standing in the fractured amber and violet light of Veloshun with her resonance charts still in her hands, and she was watching a human stand in the wreckage of a neural worm cluster and breathe. He turned. He found her eyes. "They didn't know what I am," Arthur Lennox said, and his voice was entirely level, as though he were reporting a minor logistical update. "Now they do." The shell necklace had broken in the phase shift. The shells lay scattered across the crystal floor, pale against the dark stone, each one catching a different fragment of broken light. Sporeth looked at them for a long time. Then she called her comms officer. "Send the message to Earth," she said. "Tell them we keep this one. Forever."